All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. And thank you for being a part of the Hypertrophy online tour. Huge thank you to Eneko for inviting me to present and everyone else behind the scenes at the Hypertrophy online tour. Again, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about body recomposition and building muscle and losing fat at the same time. This was a topic that has really interested me over the last few years based on my experience as a bodybuilder, my experience as a coach, and then what I was observing in the research studies I've been a part of at the University of Tampa. So when I initially got involved in the research, I wasn't expecting to necessarily see recomp because most of the studies I was a part of were training interventions focused on building muscle and gaining strength, but they didn't have direct nutritional control, or there was no direct nutritional intervention to really enhance somebody's body composition. So we weren't putting people in small deficits or having them at theoretical maintenance to ensure that some sort of fat loss would occur. But when we would look at the results, we realized that a lot of people were building muscle and losing fat simultaneously. And although I would constantly see this with a lot of the clients I work with, it was quite fascinating to me that a lot of people in the evidence-based space and in the research world weren't talking about body recomposition. And actually, on the other side of the spectrum, they would constantly say that body recomposition wasn't feasible for people with training experience. It was only feasible for beginners, people that were not familiar with resistance training, or those who were overweight or obese. Anyway, why is there so much interest around body recomposition, and why is this a debate in the first place? So I kind of briefly want to talk to you guys about the difference between claims versus evidence. This is a typical fitness magazine that you may see in stores. And as you can see right on the front, it says lose fat and gain muscle with our no-fail plan, right? A lot of people would consider this just overhyped marketing, and people in the evidence-based space would again say body recomposition isn't really feasible for people with experience. But the literature just did not say that. And over the last 5 to 10 years, as a lot of people started educating different consumers or different demographics through social media platforms, we kept seeing very black and white explanations and suggestions when it came to training advice and nutrition advice. And the truth of the matter is, these complex nutritional topics are not black and white. There's a huge gray area, and context is so specific, and there is so much nuance to a lot of these topics, especially when it comes to body composition outcomes, right? How much muscle can somebody build? How much fat can somebody lose? And at what rate can they build muscle and or lose fat, right? So you would see these general recommendations online where, hey, if you want to build muscle, you have to be in a calorie surplus, and you should set your protein at this very black and white suggestion. And then they gave you a recommendation in regards to how you can distribute the rest of your macronutrients. On the other end of the spectrum, you would see claims where, like, if you want to burn fat or lose fat, you have to be in a calorie deficit. And then they would make, again, protein recommendations, so on and so forth. But the truth of the matter is, again, it's not black and white. And there's this huge gray area where when you gain a greater understanding of the nutritional and training concepts, you can really manipulate your body composition in a more precise manner, right? So again, here's just another marketing example where it says quick fix fat loss, your 8-week guide to burning body fat and building muscle. So just a few years ago, somebody in the evidence-based space may say that this image here and this magazine cover here is, again, just like false information and overhyped marketing. And then this black and white information is more accurate. But the truth of the matter is, it's just a very complex topic, and there's more nuance to understand. So why is there so much confusion, and what are some of the primary variables at play when it comes to body recomposition? So first and foremost, it's really important to understand the differences between body weight and body composition. Your scale weight, again, is just your total body mass. I'll dive into that a little bit further on a different slide. How is body composition being assessed? Are you objectively measuring this with some sort of technological piece of equipment, like a DEXA scan or a bioelectrical impedance device? Or are you just visually looking to see, is my physique improving? Am I looking more muscular and I'm looking leaner, right? The training status of the subject is going to matter significantly. So again, if they're novice, intermediate, or advanced trainees, as well as what has their training looked like over the last 3 months, right? So a really quick example, I would consider myself a more advanced lifter, but at the moment, I'm not in my peak muscularity condition, right? I'm slightly detrained. I'm not hitting strength PRs at the moment, right? I'm not at the strongest I've ever been. So even though I'm advanced, I actually do have some ability to recomp right now in this current phase, because the last 3 months in regards to training and nutrition hasn't been extremely precise, and I haven't been crossing all my T's and dotting all my I's. So even though I might have 12 years of training experience and somebody might categorize me as being advanced, that doesn't mean I can't recomp successfully right now, right? And then there are such large individual differences just based off of their genetics and how much potential one has, okay? We'll talk about that further as well. Other factors that are going to impact one's ability to successfully recomp is going to be their nutritional intake and the strategies that are being employed, right? So what are their total calories at? What is their energy balance looking like right now? Are they in a deficit, a surplus, or at maintenance? What is their macronutrient balance looking like as well? Are they on a very high protein diet or a low protein diet? What is their meal timing and meal frequency looking like? So on and so forth, right? There's a lot of nutritional factors that can impact someone's adaptations. Also, what duration of time are we looking at, right? Are we looking at a 1 day time span? Are we looking at a week? Are we looking at 12 weeks? Are we looking at 6 months? Or are we looking at a year plus, right? The truth of the matter is we are tapping into fuel sources throughout the entire day, some of that being glycogen, some of that potentially being body fat. And we're having spikes and dips in muscle protein synthesis, as well as muscle protein breakdown. So the time period that one is discussing is also relevant in regards to how much may they be able to recomposition, right? Each individual's sleep is going to significantly impact their body composition, their hormonal health, their ability to perform well in the gym and recover from their training. So sleep quality and quantity can go a very long way. And then your overall health status and hormonal profile also plays a role. So let's dive into some of the literature. In 2020, I published this narrative review with my colleagues titled Body Recomposition: Can Trained Individuals Build Muscle and Lose Fat at the Same Time? And this was published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. They had like a special topics edition, totally dedicated to bodybuilding and physique athletes, which was super cool. So this study looked at a lot of the research. I'm not going to cover all of the studies within this narrative review, but it is available for open access, so you guys can check that out. And there are also other papers within that special topics journal that I highly recommend you guys checking out. One other paper that I collaborated with Dr. Guillermo Escalante on was on fasted cardio, fasted versus fed cardio for physique athletes. Is there any potential benefits to doing that? So definitely recommend you guys check that out. So first and foremost, let's quickly discuss the difference between body weight and body composition, right? Again, Your body weight is just your total body mass, and your body composition are the different compartments that make up your total body mass, right? So you have lean mass being one compartment, or fat-free mass. Skeletal muscle is what we're most focused on here. Okay, that's only one component. You also have fat mass. Fat mass can be broken down into different sublayers, so to speak. So we obviously have subcutaneous fat underneath the skin. That's essentially what we can pinch, and what physique athletes and people in the general public are most concerned about losing, because that's going to improve their visual physique the most. But visceral fat is also super important for overall health, right? So unfortunately, today in modern society, as the obesity epidemic continues to increase, visceral fat is highly correlated to a lot of different disease states, such as fatty liver disease, diabetes, so on and so forth. You also have intramuscular triglycerides, and you also have things like essential fatty acids, omega-3s, omega-6s in your brain, so on and so forth, right? You then have bone mineral content, and then we also have a ton of water in our body. So we have total body water, and then different compartments where you have intracellular water and extracellular water. All right, so when it comes to objectively assessing body recomposition, there are a lot of tools in our toolbox when it comes to different techniques, different assessments that we can use. So in this paper, we went over different methodology. The gold standard for body composition is going to be a 4-compartment model where you have fat-free mass, fat mass, bone mineral content, and you also have body water. So those 4 compartments are going to be the most accurate. You also have DEXA scans, which is the gold standard for bone mineral density, but it's not the gold standard for overall body composition. That's going to break down into lean body mass, fat mass, and bone mineral content. But again, it doesn't have any body water. Then you have different devices, right? A lot of people in commercial gyms today use bioelectrical impedance. Those devices can be really good for general public, but the further away you get from the norm, the more inaccurate those devices can be. So if you're working with a physique athlete that is extremely, extremely lean, it's probably not going to be too accurate. And if you're working with somebody who is extremely obese, it's also not going to be too accurate. So if you think of a normal distribution curve where the majority of the population, or 65% of the population, is going to fall in the middle, those devices can be really good for those people. But the more extreme you get on either end of the spectrum, the less accurate they may be. And another thing to consider when it comes to bioelectrical impedance devices, some of them are just handheld, or just taking a measurement from your feet, right? So some body weight scales use this. If they're just utilizing bioelectrical impedance from the upper body via your hands, or the lower body via your feet, there's going to be pretty large error rates there as well, compared to bioelectrical impedances that are using both your hands and your feet. Those are much more accurate. So things like in-body scans are becoming very popular, okay? Another thing that you can consider as general practitioners, or somebody who is trying to undergo an improvement in their body composition, is utilizing very basic tools like waist circumference measurements, as well as skin thickness or skin caliper devices, right? This is directly measuring your skin fold and your subcutaneous layer. So this is a great piece of technology to utilize when trying to track body composition changes. All right, so practically, do you really need that objective data? Do you need a DEXA scan? Do you need a BIA? Truthfully, you don't, right? You can go a very long way with just taking very precise and consistent progress photos, and maybe utilizing one other measurement tool. So right here, I have a client that only lost 2 pounds on the scale, so around 1 kilo, but also lost 4.5 inches around her waist. So even though this isn't a physique athlete that was trying to build a ton of muscle, you can clearly state that she lost a significant amount of fat, especially around the midsection, and also did build muscle, especially in the legs and the delts and the arms, right? Here's another client that underwent a very significant body recomposition phase, and this was in a very short period of time as well. Even though his scale weight actually went up by 7 pounds, you can tell that he's way, way leaner. His midsection is much tighter, and his muscularity also looks fuller. So this was a very successful and extreme recomposition in a very short period of time. This was only about 12 weeks of a change from pre to post. Here's a different female client, much older lady. She's over 42 years of age at this time. And this was a very short time period as well, believe it or not. When somebody doesn't have too much training experience and or they really start to optimize their training and they're progressively overloading in a much more trackable manner, you can see pretty significant changes. So over here, her waist went down 6 centimeters and her glutes actually have come up. As you can tell, the body composition is just significantly different. And again, even though she has gained body weight, total body mass, her body composition is much better. And that is so important for females, especially because a lot of females have a goal to lose weight when a lot of times their dream physique that they're trying to attain isn't necessarily a lighter body weight. It's just a much more muscular and a much less fat physique. But that can be a heavier scale weight down the road, right? So again, it's important to not get too caught up in the scale depending on the individual and the context. And then here's another client of mine. His name is Dr. Francisco Navarro, a fantastic psychiatrist, child psychiatrist out in California. And he underwent a extremely significant body recomposition from a contest prep phase that this was well over a 1.5 year time span. So it took a lot of time to achieve this. Okay. So what do we need to build muscle and what do we need to burn fat? First and foremost, fat loss is better understood than muscle building. Muscle building is very complex and there's so many genetic differences from person to person. We understand the law of thermodynamics and the overall concepts of energy balance on a weight gain versus weight loss perspective. So everyone's familiar with calories in versus calories out kind of concept. We understand the 3,500 calorie rule, even though it doesn't always play out that way and it is quite complex. We generally understand how large of a deficit one should be in to expect 1 pound of fat loss, right? On the other end of the spectrum, it is extremely difficult to try to quantify how much protein and or calories are required for someone to build 1 pound of muscle, right? So our understanding on the physiological mechanistic sense is much different. And muscle building, we're still scratching the surface there. There's still a lot more for us to understand. We understand some key mechanisms that stimulate muscle hypertrophy and increase skeletal muscle mass accretion. And some of those key mechanisms are mechanical tension being the most important, metabolic stress and muscle damage also being potential components that lead to muscle hypertrophy over time, right? And then most importantly, when it comes to muscle building and increasing our skeletal muscle mass, we understand that we have to have a positive nitrogen balance, right? There needs to be greater muscle protein synthesis relative to muscle protein breakdown if we're going to be building a net positive there. Now, this was a really great paper by Slater and colleagues, and the title is an energy surplus required to maximize skeletal muscle hypertrophy associated with resistance training? I want to share a quote from this paper. They stated that various dietary interventions have been proposed to influence muscle hypertrophy, including the manipulation of protein intake, specific supplement prescription, and creation of an energy surplus. While recent research has provided significant insight into optimization of dietary protein intake and application of evidence-based supplements, the specific energy surplus required to facilitate muscle hypertrophy is unknown. However, there is a clear evidence of an anabolic stimulus possible from an energy surplus, even independent of resistance training. Common textbook recommendations are based solely on the assumed energy stored within the tissue being assimilated. Unfortunately, such guidance likely fails to account for other energetically expensive processes associated with muscle hypertrophy, the acute metabolic adjustments that occur in response to an energy surplus, or individual nuances like training experience and energy status of the individual. Long story short, this paper, as well as my narrative review, makes it very clear that there is so much scientific literature demonstrating people building muscle in caloric deficits, as well as caloric maintenance, as well as a caloric surplus. So an energy surplus isn't required to build muscle, but it is likely a better approach to take if you're trying to maximize muscle growth. But there are so many factors, such as the individual's body fat levels and training experience, that are going to influence one's ability to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. So what modalities can induce muscle hypertrophy, right? Obviously, we're going to be most focused on resistance training, going to the gym, getting stronger on our compound lifts, on our isolation lifts, and progressively overloading over time. That is going to be the key. However, I quickly want to share with you some literature that also demonstrates muscle building and or recomposition that isn't necessarily using traditional resistance training. Okay, so this first study is demonstrated a gain in fat-free mass and a reduction in fat mass, so successful body recomposition, in non-athletic adults. And they did not exercise, they just utilized a whole body electrostimulation machine, right? So if you guys are familiar with EMS or electromyostimulation, these devices alone led to muscle growth and fat loss for these sedentary, non-athletic adults, okay? And the reason for that is because the electrical signal was creating some amount of mechanical tension and contraction at the muscle. There was some sort of energetic demand from those contractions from the electromyostimulation. And that mechanical tension led to an increase in muscle protein synthesis. And the energy demands of the muscle contraction could have also led to fat oxidation, and the energetic demands of muscle protein synthesis can probably led to those individuals tapping into their fat stores just to support that process of muscle building. All right. So again, here's just a quick piece of evidence that demonstrated body recomposition without resistance training. Here was a different study that actually looked at no load training, which is essentially moving through a range of motion at your highest intensity without external load. So it would be like performing a bicep curl without actually having a weight in your hand. But as you're performing this concentric, you're flexing the bicep as hard as you possibly can. And as you're performing your eccentric, you're creating tension in the bicep and flexing the tricep simultaneously. And they actually saw muscle thickness gains, which is due to muscle hypertrophy, in both the biceps and the triceps in these untrained individuals from no load training. All right. And again, this can be explained through the mechanical tension that was created, the fact that that stimulus of this no load training was higher than these individuals' previous baseline. So even though they aren't resistance training directly with external load, they were still creating some sort of muscle stimulus, and that led to an increase in muscle protein synthesis, and that led to greater muscle size, right? And then this last study, I just wanted to pull up really quickly as well. They utilized either both concurrent resistance training or sprint training alone, and they found both groups responded. So one group only cycled and performed sprints on a bicycle, and they still gained muscle on their lower body, and they still lost fat, right? So even though they weren't squatting, leg pressing, doing leg extensions, whatever it may be, these individuals still gained muscle in their lower body while losing total body fat mass. So training status is going to be a huge factor that impacts one's ability to undergo a successful body recomposition phase. If you have an untrained individual, their ability to build muscle is so high, depending on what their current body fat level is, you should basically expect them to recomp, right? Especially if they have a little bit of excess body fat on their body, you should expect them to recomp. Another thing I want you guys to take into consideration is one other form of body recomposition can basically be building more muscle than you gain fat mass. So real quick example, let's take somebody who weighs 70 kilos, right? Let's just say they gained 5 kilos over X period of time. If they gained 4 kilos of lean body mass and 1 kilo of fat mass, even though they gained body fat from a whole body perspective, you can still say they recomped because their body fat percentage went down because they built a lot more muscle than they gained a lot more muscle compared to the amount of fat mass they gained, right? So that's just another thing to take into consideration. If your body fat percent is improving, that is going to lead to significant improvements visually. And that is basically what most people are looking for when they are trying to recomp anyway. So what determines your training status? We utilize very general terms in the literature, such as untrained, beginner or novice, intermediate, advanced, and elite, okay? These terms aren't always specifically defined, and there can also be like a pretty gray area with those terms in themselves, right? So some people might consider themselves an advanced lifter, but somebody else might consider them an intermediate just based on their strength or how much muscle they have on their physique. On the other end of the spectrum, somebody might consider themselves an intermediate, but perhaps they actually are considered more advanced, depending on who you ask. Again, based on how many years of training experience they have, what their strength levels are, so on and so forth. So these terms are pretty vague, and getting a little bit more detail is going to probably be better in regards to understanding one's ability to potentially recomp or not. So years of training experience is one, and then somebody's strength level. So what is their absolute strength? Like what are their 1 RMs on some of their lifts, whether it's a bench press, a squat, or a deadlift, or what is their strength endurance like, right? What are their 10 rep maxes, or maybe how many reps to failure can they perform if they were to take 70% of their 1 rep max as an example. Now, the last factor is something that I think is most important, and it basically applies to everybody, whether you're an intermediate, an advanced, or a beginner, right? What current shape are you in? And what has your training looked like over the past 3 months? Again, in the very beginning of this, I said, even though I am an advanced lifter, I am slightly detrained and I am not at my peak when it comes to total muscle mass as well as my strength. So I can regain my strength and regain my muscle very quickly and undergo a successful recomp right now. Whereas when I was in my peak strength and my peak physique status, I would not have been able to recomp because I have too much training experience as well as very low body fat levels, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you also need to take into consideration what type of training has somebody been doing. Somebody might have 3 to 5+ years of resistance training experience, but maybe they weight train 2 to 3 times per week, and maybe they play a sport, right? This is something I saw a lot with the college students in some of our resistance training studies in the lab. A lot of them might lift 3 days per week. Perhaps they were doing like full body training and a lot of strength and conditioning style training. And they never did like bodybuilding hypertrophy focused training, right? So even though they know how to squat proficiently, they know how to bench press, they have experience with lifting weights, if they haven't been training like a bodybuilder, they're still going to be pretty novice, even if they have multiple years of experience under their belt. And they're probably pretty far away from their genetic potential when it comes to how much muscle mass they can carry. Therefore, they probably can build more muscle mass, and their ability to recomp is probably greater. So this sliding scale over here is essentially how I predetermine somebody's ability to successfully recomp. Okay. So the amount of muscle mass somebody has relative to their genetic potential, as well as the amount of body fat they're currently carrying or their body fat percentage. So if you have somebody that is extremely untrained and they have a lot of genetic potential to fulfill when it comes to muscle building, and they have high levels of body fat, that person has the greatest ability to recomp, right? If you have somebody in the middle where they haven't reached their muscular potential yet, but they definitely kind of successfully attain those newbie gains, and they're carrying a moderate amount of body fat, they can still recomp, but probably to a lesser degree. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you have somebody who has basically reached their genetic potential from a muscularity standpoint and they're very lean, you should not expect them to recomp. You have to utilize much more traditional gaining phases and cutting phases. Okay. And again, someone's genetic ceiling does exist. We might not know exactly what that is looking like, but depending on your age and your training experience, you can still probably build a small amount of muscle, but it's just going to take a longer period of time. So I want to share some data from our lab. This was the first study I was a part of during my master's program, and it was titled Autoregulation of Exercise Selection Training Regimen Produces Small Increases in Lean Body Mass and Maximal Strength Adaptations in Strength-Trained Individuals. So without getting too deeply involved in the differences of the study, we had two groups that were both training full body 3 times per week, okay? One group auto-regulated their exercise selection, and then the other group had a fixed exercise selection. So they had to do what was provided to them on their spreadsheet that day. What I wanted to point out here is that when we look at scientific research, most people just report the mean changes and the standard deviation. So you can see that the autoregulatory group gained 1.6 kilos of lean body mass, and the fixed group only gained 0.98 kilograms of lean body mass. All right. Now, this is looking at the group average. When you look at the individuals, you will actually see that some people didn't gain much lean body mass at all. Some individuals even lost lean body mass, and some individuals gained a significant amount of lean body mass. So you as an individual or you as a coach, you don't necessarily care about these group means too much, right? You want to see how different individuals are responding. So again, some subjects gained up to 9.4 pounds of lean body mass while losing 1.87 pounds of fat mass simultaneously, while others lost up to 3.3 pounds of lean body mass and simultaneously gained 5.2 pounds of fat mass, even though they were doing the same training 3 times per week in our lab supervised, right? Long story short, if you look at this data, you would see that 5 out of the 17 total subjects did gain some amount of lean mass while losing some amount of fat mass simultaneously. And then the most extreme case was this one subject who gained 8.6 pounds of lean mass while losing 4.2 pounds of fat mass. So I found that fascinating to see such large individual differences from person to person. And I kept wanting to explore how often will this occur in the literature, right? So the second study I was a part of was actually in collegiate volleyball players. So even though they have resistance training experience, again, their lifting is very strength and conditioning orientated. It is not training like a bodybuilder. It is not hypertrophy training necessarily. However, they are still going to gain muscle mass. This study was set up in a very strength and conditioning based manner. We were investigating the differences between velocity based training protocols and optimal training loads. Long story short, the thing I want to focus on here is that one group on average gained 5.94 pounds of lean body mass while simultaneously losing 4.92 pounds of fat mass. And then the other group gained 5.9 pounds of lean mass while losing 5.9 pounds of fat mass. And this was only in a 7-week time period while eating 1.8 grams per kilogram of their total body weight. So this was a very, very extreme result that was demonstrated here. And again, when looking at the different individual responses, some were even more impressive than these group means. So here is an image. I'm going to go over some more data from our lab really briefly and then get into data from other labs. But here's an image of a ultrasound actually looking at the muscle thickness of somebody's pectoralis major muscle, of their chest muscle. But what you will see is in this pre-picture, this entire layer is their subcutaneous fat layer that you can pinch with your finger, right? If you were to use a skin caliper, this is what you would be measuring. And then from here to here, you're looking at the pec major. This bright white line is the fascia that separates their pec major from their pec minor. Anyway, as you can see just from this ultrasound image, it's quite clear that this individual gained muscle, their muscle thickness increased from here to here, while losing a pretty significant amount of subcutaneous fat. So we can see this obviously visually if you're looking at an individual's physique, but there are also different assessment tools that can demonstrate body recomposition. So the data that I just shared before was utilizing DEXA, and now this data is utilizing an ultrasound, right? So this study was titled Progressive Resistance Training Volumes, the Effects on Muscle Thickness, Mass, and Strength. We had 3 groups here, and we were looking at different weekly volumes to see how that would impact changes in size and strength over time. This data right here is just from one group. You can see this is their pre and post lean body mass in kilograms, the delta change, and then their pre and post fat mass in kilograms and the delta change. As you can see, there are very significant differences from individual to individual. If you look at the group means only, you would see that there was a 1.7 kilo increase in lean body mass, while there was a 0.7 kilo reduction in fat mass. But when you look at some individual data, you will see some extreme outliers, okay? If you look at subject 28, you will see that they gained 9.2 kilos of lean body mass while simultaneously losing 1.8 kilos of fat mass. So this is extreme body recomposition that is occurring here, okay? And if you just look up and down this table, you can see that each individual is responding quite differently. Some people are barely making any gains at all. Some people are actually losing lean body mass. Most people are losing fat mass if you look here, but some people did gain very small amounts of body fat as well. Okay. So there are other researchers that have also found this to be true, and there are other factors outside of their training status or their training regimen that is impacting their body composition outcomes. So here was a study that came out of Bill Campbell's lab at the University of South Florida, and they were looking at the effects of high protein intake versus low protein intake on aspiring female physique athletes over an 8-week time period. So both groups were being supervised in the lab, undergoing the same exact resistance training protocol, but one was consuming 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, and then the low protein group was consuming 0.9 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And what they found was, even though they were training 4 days per week, doing an upper-lower split, the group that was consuming this high protein diet at 2.5 grams per kilogram, they demonstrated a much larger body recomposition effect. So they actually gained 2.1 kilos of fat-free mass while simultaneously losing 2.1 kilos of fat mass, even though they were consuming 420 more calories per day on average, okay? On the other hand, the low protein group, they did gain a statistically significant amount of fat-free mass, but it was much smaller. They only gained 0.6 kilos, and they did not demonstrate a significant reductions in fat mass, okay? More importantly, if you look at the low protein group, 3 out of the 9 subjects actually lost fat-free mass, whereas if you look at the high protein group, every single individual gained some amount of fat-free mass, all right? So this data further supports the importance in high protein intake. And again, even though the higher protein group was consuming around 400 more calories per day on average, they saw a much better body composition outcome. So this whole general idea that all calories are created equal, this simply isn't true when it comes to body composition performance. And again, because protein has such a high thermic effect, it is the most thermogenic macronutrient, and it causes you to burn more calories. It starts tipping and it changes the caloric expenditure from the caloric intake equation, right? And that overall net balance. So here is additional data from Jose Antonio's lab, and they were looking at very high protein diets, so 3.4 grams per kilogram per day, while undergoing heavy resistance training programs. And again, this was in both males and females, and they saw a significant improvement in the high protein group when it came to body composition, all right? On average, both groups here gained lean body mass while they were undergoing the training protocol. But if you look at the individual data, the most interesting thing was the high protein group actually lost more fat mass compared to the normal protein group, okay? So the normal protein group went from 15.1 kilograms of fat mass only down to 14.8. So there was a 2.1 kilogram reduction, whereas the high protein group went from 13.5 kilograms of fat mass down to 11.9 kilograms of fat mass. So they lost significantly more body fat, even though they were consuming about 500 more calories per day. And again, it's important to note here that this normal protein group would still be considered high to most evidence-based people, right? A lot of people in the space recommend just 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. That's basically what they did here. They were at 2.3 grams of protein per kilogram. So this is basically comparing a high protein group to a very high protein group, right? And as you can see from the results, they both gained a similar amount of fat-free mass or lean body mass, but that very high protein group actually lost more fat mass, even though they were consuming more total calories, okay? And this is being demonstrated over and over in the literature. So when it comes to practical suggestions on protein, I recommend that you determine these values based on lean body mass rather than total body weight or total body mass. It's going to be a little bit more precise, and it is definitely much more practical when you're working with overweight or obese individuals, right? If you're working with someone that maybe is 90 kilograms in body weight and has a very, very high body fat percent, there is no reason for them to consume, 2.2 grams per kilo of total body mass. You're much better off utilizing lean body mass. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you have somebody that's relatively light in their total body weight, but they're very, very lean, and their goal is to build muscle and or recomp, you're going to be much better off going above their body weight with protein intake, and again, utilizing their lean body mass, not their total mass. So the more body fat an individual has, the less protein they'll likely need to positively change their body composition. The leaner individuals and or those that are in a larger caloric deficit, the more protein one should consume. I suggest utilizing 2.6 to 3.5 grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass or lean body mass, okay? This sliding scale is going to depend on how much body fat the individual has. So the more body fat somebody has, the lower end of that 2.6 to 3.5 spectrum you can be. The leaner the individual is, the higher end you can be on that 2.6 to 3.5 range. For those that are tracking total protein intake, I highly recommend that you increase your protein even further when you're entering these really large caloric surpluses, okay? The reason for that is because as you increase carbs and fat while you're in a gaining phase or you're in this caloric surplus, you're going to be consuming more and more trace proteins from your carbs and your fats. And those trace proteins are incomplete and they have a very poor amino acid profile when it comes to their ability to positively impact muscle protein synthesis, right? So we understand that the branched chain amino acids, leucine, valine, isoleucine, are very important for muscle protein synthesis. And we know that the 9 essential amino acids are key to continue fueling muscle protein synthesis. So if you're consuming a ton of carbs and a ton of fat, and a lot of your protein is coming as incomplete trace proteins from that, you need to increase your total daily protein to ensure that you're getting in a sufficient amount of animal protein on a daily basis, and you're getting in a sufficient amount of the essential amino acids that are fueling this muscle protein synthetic response, right? So here are some examples I want to provide. If you have an 85 kilogram male that's around 20% body fat, you would say that they have approximately 68 kilos of fat-free mass. So you can take this 68 kilos and multiply it anywhere between 2.6 and call it 3.1, just because, again, they have more body fat. That would give you a protein intake on a daily basis ranging from 175 grams to 210 grams, okay? Let's take a 63 kilogram female that's around 25% body fat. That means they have around 48 kilograms of fat-free mass. And my protein recommendations would be anywhere from 125 to 150 grams per day. And then let's take a leaner individual. So you have a 70 kilogram male at 8% body fat. Even though they have 65-ish kilograms of fat-free mass, I would recommend a very high protein intake for them at 180 grams to 225 grams per day, okay? Another thing I want to briefly talk about that's not necessarily in these presentation slides is meal frequency, okay? A lot of people in the evidence-based space might say that meal frequency really isn't that important. but I tend to disagree when it comes to optimization, right? When you're really trying to cross all of your T's and dot all of your I's, these things can matter over the long term. All right. So if you have somebody eating a high protein diet, I would hypothesize that they're going to get better body composition outcomes if they're having 4 to 6 meals per day or 4 to 6 protein feedings per day compared to 2 to 3 protein feedings per day, even if their protein intake was equated. With that being said, it is also just a lot more practical for people on high protein diets to have more frequent meal feedings, right? If I'm eating 200 grams of protein per day, I personally don't want to distribute that over 3 meals, right? I would much rather have maybe 4 meals per day at 50 grams or 6 meals per day and distribute that across the day rather than having, 2 massive meals at 100 grams of protein per feeding just to hit my protein goal. So there is a lot of data that shows there is a anabolic threshold to muscle protein synthesis within a feeding. So as long as you're maximizing that, if you're consuming more protein than that in one sitting, it is not benefiting the muscle protein synthetic response. Whereas if you have more frequent feedings, it can be advantageous because you're allowing muscle protein synthesis to come up, you're allowing it to dip, and then you're maximizing that response more times per day, more times per week, more times per month, so on and so forth. So again, just in regards to meal frequency, I really do recommend splitting this up between 4 to 6 feedings per day. What are some other factors that impact body composition outcomes? Sleep is going to be absolutely massive. And then somebody's hormonal profile can also be pretty important as well, right? So I want to show you guys some studies that demonstrate the impacts on sleep and fat loss, all right? So this first study by Wang and colleagues had 2 groups. One was a caloric restricted group that was not sleep restricted. And then the other group was a caloric restricted group that was also sleep restricted. All right. All things were equal here, except the sleep restricted group slept 1 hour less than the other groups 5 nights per week. And believe it or not, the sleep restricted group was allowed to sleep 1 more hour per night on the weekends to see if you can kind of catch up on this lost sleep. It's really important to note that this was just a dietary study. It was not an exercise or training study, okay? So they were not resistance training at all. They just had all subjects in a 500-calorie deficit in both groups, okay? Now, if you look at their body weight, both groups lost basically the same amount of total body mass. There is a 3.3 kilogram reduction in the caloric restricted group and a 3.2 kilogram reduction in the caloric restriction group plus sleep restriction. However, if you look at the changes in lean mass and fat mass, there were significant differences between the two, all right? The caloric restricted group lost 80% of their total body weight coming from fat mass. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, the group that had this sleep restriction of only 1 hour per night, 85% of their weight loss came from lean compartments, right? So it could be muscle, it could be organ, and only 17% of their weight loss actually came from fat mass. So when you look at this data here and how they're completely opposite, this really points to favor how important it is that you have good sleep hygiene practices in hand when you are trying to maximize body composition outcomes. Also, the group that wasn't sleep restricted, they actually had a slight increase in their resting metabolic rate. So as they lost a significant amount of body fat while retaining most of their lean body mass, their resting metabolic rate was actually preserved and actually went up a little bit, whereas the sleep restricted group saw a very small reduction in their resting metabolic rate, which again, over time can be problematic. All right, this other study also looks at insufficient sleep and how that can undermine your caloric or dietary efforts to reduce your total fat mass. Again, they had one group sleeping around 8.5 hours per night, and the other group sleeping just 5.5 hours per night. Now, when you look at the total weight that was lost, it was actually fairly similar between groups. But similar to that previous study by Wang and colleagues, as you can see, the group that spent 8.5 hours in bed lost, a decent amount of lean mass, but also a significant amount of fat mass. And then the group that did not sleep that much at all lost way more lean body mass and much less fat mass. So again, just highlighting the importance of getting really good sleep if you're trying to optimize body composition outcomes. Now, this was super cool. This was a study that implemented sleep hygiene practices while also putting these subjects under a 10-week resistance training program. Okay. Now, they gave really general and really simple and basic sleep hygiene education to one group, and then the other group didn't get any sleep hygiene education. They just performed the same exact exercise regimen. All right. Some of the recommendations that they made for the sleep hygiene group was to, keep it dark, quiet, and cool in the room that you sleep in. Go to bed and wake up at the same time of the day during the whole week. Try to get 8 hours of sleep if you can. And then 2 hours before bed, turn down the lights, try to not use technology, potentially use blue light blockers or turn on the blue light filters on these pieces of technology. Try not to exercise late in the evening. No food, coffee, black tea, or exercise really, really late in the evening. And do calming activities that can have a positive outcome on your overall sleep quality, right? So everyone is very familiar with these sort of recommendations. But again, they educated one group on positive sleep hygiene recommendations, and then the other group did not get those recommendations whatsoever. Now, what they found here was quite interesting. Both groups did gain a significant amount of lean body mass over this 10-week training period. Okay. So the exercise plus sleep hygiene group gained 3.5 pounds of lean mass, and the exercise only group gained 3.1 pounds of lean body mass. They were both statistically significant. However, the group that implemented these sleep hygiene practices lost significantly more body fat, right? They lost 3.9 pounds of body fat, whereas the group that wasn't practicing these positive changes in sleep hygiene, they only lost 1.8 pounds of body fat. So I found this study fascinating. It came out in 2020. And again, they utilized a sleep hygiene plus exercise intervention strategy. And although both groups did undergo a successful body recomposition, the group that had better sleep practices had much better body composition outcomes. All right. Now, what are some of the other factors that influence body composition? It can be hormonal changes. I actually want to quickly talk about some of the potential positives that occur when one is losing body fat or entering a diet, right? In the physique transformation space, a lot of people focus on just the negatives that can occur while dieting, but for general population, entering a caloric deficit and losing body fat just has a host of positive health outcomes, right? This usually leads to a reduction in total triglycerides. It usually leads to an improvement in cholesterol levels. it usually leads to an improvement in blood pressure, resting heart rate, and so many other factors, right? Fasting blood glucose levels, insulin sensitivity, sleep quality, energy levels. There are so many positives that come from a hormonal and health standpoint to the general person who loses weight. So I just want us to also remember that entering a deficit and losing fat isn't all bad, right? There's a ton of benefits that come with that. Now, in the physique enhancement space or the competitive bodybuilding space, when we're getting to extreme levels of low body fat, yes, there are some negative hormonal and health changes that occur, not just physiologically, but also psychologically. So here is some data from a case study by my friend Andrew Pardue. Again, he's a natural bodybuilder that underwent a contest prep, and they demonstrated a bunch of hormonal changes that are very, very common to occur when one enters a dieting phase. Okay, so if you look at the data from November here, this is where he was at baseline before entering this caloric deficit. So this is where his body fat levels were healthy. He was around 15 to 18% body fat to start. And as you can see, he has a healthy amount of testosterone. His T3 and T4 levels are fine. This is also when TSH levels are usually low, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone is usually nice and low, maybe at 2.0 or lower. And his ghrelin, his hunger hormone, is totally under control here. Now, as he enters this caloric deficit, you see that his testosterone starts to drop. His thyroid, T3 and T4 also start to drop, right? And then in June, when this particular individual was contest lean, his testosterone levels were now being flagged as being in the unhealthy ranges. So he had low T, his cortisol levels were even higher, and his thyroid hormone was basically down to the dump, right? So even though TSH wasn't measured, I would expect TSH to go up as T3 and T4 plummet, okay? And TSH going up is not a good thing. And then also you can see that his hunger hormone also skyrocketed and was outside the normal ranges, the normal reference ranges. However, it's important to note that when somebody does go through a dieting phase and they have these quote unquote negative hormonal adaptations, they still can recover once they get back into a caloric surplus and they regain some of that body fat and get back to a healthier, more sustainable body fat level. So months after the competition, you can see that his testosterone levels did increase to quote unquote normal ranges. And even though his thyroid hormone did not return back to baseline, it did start to increase. So potentially a few months later, maybe he did fully recover, maybe he did not. It's hard to tell, but this also does point out that the recovery phase might take even longer than the diet phase did. So it's really important that after a chronic diet or after getting extremely lean, that you do spend a significant amount of time back in a surplus, back at healthy body fat levels, and that you don't jump back into a calorie deficit too soon because, again, metabolic function, hormonal health might not be in the best place. And if your thyroid is still sluggish at this point, your ability to lose fat is most likely going to be hindered, and you're probably going to have to dig even further to get the same results that you previously got. So this is why you can see some competitors, especially those that are natural, if they compete too frequently, it can actually be more and more difficult for them to successfully lose body fat. So definitely take these things into consideration when you're going through different gaining phases, different cutting phases, whether it's a mini cut, whether it's a contest prep, you definitely want to be cognitive of where your hormonal health currently is. Now, to recap really quick, go over some of the key takeaways. It's important to understand that body recomposition does occur quite regularly in multiple populations. Okay. It's not just in novice trainees, it's not just in overweight and obese individuals. This does occur in the scientific literature. and those that have 3, 5, 6 years of training experience. And it also occurs at very different magnitudes between individual to individual, probably based on a lot of genetic factors, but also based on their nutritional status, their sleep hygiene, and everything else that was discussed, right? It's really important to ensure that you're utilizing multiple tools to assess your body composition, not getting overly caught up in your total body mass or total body weight. So, when I initially have a client on board with me or get started with my team of coaches and I rarely put them in a caloric deficit right off the bat, even if their goal is fat loss. Okay. I usually start them off at caloric maintenance and I focus on optimizing other factors such as their protein intake, their meal frequency, their nutrient timing, their peri-workout nutrition strategies, and then obviously their training approach, right? I'd rather have them at theoretical maintenance and optimize every other variable, get them in a really good position, and see how their body responds while eating at theoretical maintenance. Because I see it all the time. People's scale weight might not change the first 3, 6, 8 weeks, but they're losing inches off of their waist. They're getting stronger in the gym and they're getting positive body composition adaptations. All right. So it's important to utilize other tools such as waist circumference measurements, such as potentially skin fold calibers, and definitely utilizing progress photos in the same conditions, the same lighting, at the same camera angle, right? If you're taking photos one day in the gym post workout, and then you're taking photos another day, first thing in the morning at home, you can't really compare those photos side by side and get an honest, objective assessment of what's happening to your physique. So taking standardized photos in the same lighting and the same condition is very important. Each individual's current body composition, training status, training methodologies, their nutritional intake, genetics, sleep, hormonal health, and more will impact their outcomes, as I've stated multiple times. You definitely want to make sure you're implementing progressive resistance training while having this positive nitrogen balance, so eating plenty of protein, as those are going to be the key to stimulate and support muscle hypertrophy. You also want to make sure that you're optimizing your nutritional approach, right? That can impact these acute factors. So things that can impact your training performance, like nutrient timing, that's going to impact the muscle protein synthetic response. If that's going to impact your recovery, it's going to impact your training performance the subsequent session. And that's going to impact how much strength you gain over X period of time. And that can impact how much muscle you build over X period of time. So there are so many factors that can snowball on top of one another and really give you the best ability to successfully gain strength, gain muscle, and improve your body composition. All right. The details do matter when you're trying to optimize. If you just want to get 80% of the results, yeah, maybe you can just focus on the big rocks. But if you really want to maximize your fullest potential, these fine details to nutritional strategies and training strategies are going to make an impact. One thing I think that's really important to understand is although some of these strategies in the scientific literature might not have been statistically significant, that does not mean that they're not practically significant. So in a lot of these studies, if the duration of the study was longer, or if the study had more subjects participating in it, we potentially would see different outcomes, right? More importantly, when it comes to coaching or optimizing an individual approach, you want to make sure you're doing all that you can to get the best results possible, right? If you're working with clients, again, don't underestimate the power of setting them up at theoretical maintenance, focusing on a lot of these finer details that are related to training and nutrition first, before putting them in a deficit or a surplus, depending on the individual's goal, their training experience, and a lot of the other factors we previously discussed, right? Now, I wanted to make a lot of practical suggestions for you guys, but the truth of the matter is there is so much nuance and specific context that can impact the suggestions that I would make when it comes to somebody who's trying to recomp. So I just wanted to share this table that comes from one of the nutrition guides that I wrote with Jeff Nippard on body recomposition. And I wanted to provide this table because depending on the goal and the experience level of the male or female, you'll see that there is a different suggested approach. And again, there is just so much gray area and there's so much nuance that a coach needs to take into consideration, making these really vague black and white recommendations just isn't going to cut it. So just as a quick example, if you have these 3 different beginners, right? Let's say one person's primary goal is to lose fat. I would probably put them in something like a 20% caloric deficit, right? Around below theoretical maintenance, while applying the protein strategies that were previously mentioned, while applying a bunch of different nutrient timing strategies that are discussed in the book, right? However, if somebody's primary goal is to build muscle, I might actually put them in a 25 calorie surplus. So as you can see, these males here, they were ranging between 18 to 20+% body fat. These females perhaps were ranging at 28 to 30+% body fat. So they're really, really focused on fat loss. That's their primary goal. On the other end of the spectrum, even though you still have beginners that you're working with, these beginners are much leaner. Maybe the males are between 8 and 12% body fat, and the females are between 18 and 22% body fat. I'm going to put them in a caloric surplus, and I would still expect them to gain much more muscle than they're gaining fat mass. So their body fat percent can actually still go down, and their physique can dramatically improve, and they would successfully recomp, right? And then maybe you have somebody that they're in this healthy range of body fat between 12 and 18 for male or 22 and 28 for female. Maybe I just keep them at theoretical maintenance calories. I don't put them in surplus or a deficit. We put them in a high protein diet, and we really, really focus on their progress in the gym, their objective outcomes when it comes to their strength performance. And I would still expect to see a positive body composition outcome, right? When you look at this table, there's a lot of different recommendations, again, based on their experience level, based on their body fat and body composition level, so on and so forth. So I just wanted to share this table because for me to make practical recommendations, it is really done on an individual N=1 level. It's not done in a very broad spectrum. So I can't recommend the guide enough if you're looking to learn more about individualizing somebody's nutritional intake. All right. So if you guys are looking for more information on body recomposition, I definitely recommend you check out the narrative review article that I mentioned earlier by my colleagues and I. It is open access. If you have access to this PowerPoint presentation directly, you can click the link. If not, you can just type in the title in a very simple search engine search and it will come up. If you guys want to learn how I personally set up my client's dietary approach in a very in-depth manner and how I fine-tune a lot of things like peri-workout nutrition, meal frequency, the whole 9 when it comes to nutrition, I highly recommend you guys check out the Ultimate Guide to Body Recomposition. You can find it at schoolofgains.com. And to everybody tuning in here on the hypertrophy online course, I will provide a 15% coupon code by utilizing the discount code HypertrophyOT for the hypertrophy online tour. All right. So if you guys have any questions at all, feel free to shoot me an email at chris@competitivebreed.com. Check out my website at schoolofgains.com and feel free to reach out to me on social media. It's been a pleasure communicating with all of you guys here at the Hypertrophy Online Tour. I thank you guys for checking out this lecture. And again, thank you to Eneko and everybody else behind the scenes at the Hypertrophy Online Tour for inviting me to present on body recomposition. I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. I hope you guys learned a lot. And I look forward to potentially connecting with you guys in the future as well. Thank you so much. Take care.